Part 7. Stalin is no more. Neither repented they of their murders. Revelation 9:21. Chapter 1. Looking back on it all. We never, of course, lost hope that our story would be told, since sooner or later the truth is told about all that has happened in history. But in our imagining, this would come in the rather distant future, after most of us were dead, and in a completely changed situation. I thought of myself as the chronicler of the archipelago. I wrote and wrote, but I, too, had little hope of seeing it in print in my lifetime. History is forever springing surprises even on the most perspicacious of us. If we could not foresee what it would be like, how for no visible compelling reason the earth would shudder and give, how the gates of the abyss would briefly, grudgingly part so that 2 or 3 birds of truth would fly out if they slammed to stay shut for a long time to come. So many of my predecessors had not been able to finish writing, or to preserve what they had written, or to crawl or scramble to safety. But I had this good fortune, to thrust the first handful of truth through the open jaws of the iron gates before they slammed shut again. Like matter enveloped by antimatter, it exploded instantaneously. Its explosion touched off in turn an explosion of letters. That was to be expected. But also an explosion of newspaper articles, written with gritted teeth, with ill-concealed hatred and resentment. An explosion of official praise that left a sour taste in my mouth. When former Czechs heard this fanfare from all the newspapers in unison, learned that some sort of story about the camps had come out and that the journalists were slavering over it, their unanimous conclusion was, "More lying nonsense, nothing safe from those crafty liars," that our newspapers, with their habitual immoderation, might suddenly start falling over each other to praise the truth, that's something no one could possibly imagine. Some of them were reluctant to risk soiling their hands on my story of Ivan Denisovic. But when they started reading it, a single groan broke from all those thousands, a groan of joy and of pain. Letters poured in. I treasure those letters. Only too rarely do our fellow countrymen have a chance to speak their mind on matters of public concern, and former prisoners still more rarely. Their faith had proved false, their hopes had been cheated so often, yet now they believed that the era of truth was really beginning, that at last it was possible to speak and write boldly. And they were disappointed, of course, for the 100th time. Truth, it seems, is always bashful, easily reduced to silence by the too blatant encroachment of falsehood. The prolonged absence of any free exchange of information within a country opens up a gulf of incomprehension between whole groups of the population, between millions and millions. We simply cease to be a single people, for we speak, indeed, different languages. Nonetheless, a breakthrough had been made. Oh, it was stout, the wall of lies, it looked so secure, looked built to last forever. But a breach yawned, and news broke through. Only yesterday we had no camps, no archipelago, and today there they were for the whole people, the whole world to see. Prison camps. Camps, what is more, of the fascist type. When Khrushchev, wiping the tear from his eye, gave permission for the publication of Ivan Denisovic, he was quite sure that it was about Stalin's camps, and that he had none of his own. I myself was taken by surprise when I received a stream of letters from present-day Czechs. On crumpled scraps of paper, in a blurred pencil scrawl, in stray envelopes often addressed and posted by free employees, in other words, on the sly, today's archipelago sent me its criticisms and sometimes its angry protests. These letters, too, were a single many-throated cry, but a cry that said, "What about us?" And the Czechs set up a howl. "What do you mean, never happen again? We're here inside now, and our conditions are just the same. Nothing has changed since Ivan Denisovic's time. The message was the same in letters from many different places. Any Zek who reads your book will feel bitterness and disgust because everything is just as it was. What has changed if all the laws providing for 25 years imprisonment issued under Stalin are still in force? After reading all these letters, I, who had been thinking myself a hero, saw that I hadn't a leg to stand on. In 10 years I had lost my vital link with the archipelago. For them, for today's Zeks, my book is no book. My truth is no truth unless there is a continuation, unless I go on to speak of them too. Truth must be told, and all things must change. In a declaration by the Soviet government dated December 1964, we read, "The perpetrators of monstrous crimes must never end and in no circumstances escape just retribution. The crimes of the fascist murderers, who aimed at the destruction of whole peoples, have no precedent in history." This was to prevent the Federal German Republic from introducing a statute of limitations for war criminals after 20 years had elapsed. But they show no desire to face judgment themselves, although they, too, aimed at the destruction of whole peoples. But in the USSR, no one would have to answer. No one would be looked into. While in the records office they carry out a leisurely inspection and destroy all unwanted documents, lists of people shot, orders committing prisoners to solitary confinement or the disciplinary barracks, files on investigations in the camps, denunciations from stoolies, superfluous information about practical workers and convoy guards. End of Part 7, Chapter 1. Part 7, Chapter 2. Rulers change, the archipelago remains. The special camps must have been among the best-loved brain-children of Stalin's old age. After so many experiments in punishment and re-education, this ripe perfection was finally born. A compact, faceless organization of numbers, not people, psychologically divorced from the motherland that bore it, having an entrance but no exit, devouring only enemies and producing only industrial goods and corpses. It is difficult to imagine the paternal pain which the visionary architect would have felt if he had witnessed in turn the bankruptcy of this great system of his. While he yet lived, it was shaken, it was giving off sparks, it was covered with cracks, but probably caution prevailed and these things were not reported to him. If the great Coryphaeus had lived a year or 18 months longer, it would have been impossible to conceal these explosions from him, and his weary, senile brain would have been burdened with a new decision, either to abandon his pet scheme and mix the camps again, or, on the contrary, to crown it by systematically shooting all the index-lettered thousands. But, amid weeping and wailing, the thinker died, and soon afterward his frozen hand brought crashing down his still rosy-cheeked, still hale and vigorous comrade in arms, the minister of those extraordinarily extensive, intricate, and irresolvable internal affairs. The fall of the archipelago's boss tragically accelerated the breakdown of the special camps. Number patches, the supreme discovery of the 20th century prison camp science, were hurriedly ripped off, thrown away, and forgotten. It hardly mattered when the bars had also been removed from hut windows and locks from hut doors, so that the special camps had lost the pleasant jail-like peculiarities which distinguished them from corrective labor camps. They also lifted restrictions on correspondence, which more than anything had made prisoners in special camps feel really buried alive. They even allowed visits. Dreadful thought, visits! The tide of liberalism swept on so irresistibly over the erstwhile special camps that prisoners were allowed to choose their own hairstyles. Instead of credit accounts, instead of special camp coupons, the natives were allowed to handle ordinary Soviet currency and settle their bills with cash-like people outside. Carelessly, recklessly they demolished the system which had fed them, the system which they had spent decades weaving and binding and lashing together. And were those hardened criminals at all mollified by this pampering? They were not. On the contrary, they showed their depravity and ingratitude by adopting the profoundly inappropriate, offensive, and nonsensical word, Beryaites. And now, wherever something upset them, they would yell this insult at conscientious convoy guards, long-suffering warders, and their salacious guardians, the camp chiefs. Not only did the word pain the tender-hearted practical workers, it could even be dangerous so soon after Beria's fall, because someone might make it the starting point of an accusation. For this reason, the head of one of the Kenjir camp divisions was compelled to deliver the following address from the platform. Men! In those few short years, from 1954 to 1956, they found it impossible to call the prisoners men. You may hurt the feelings of supervisory staff and the convoy troops by shouting Beryaites at them. Please stop it. To which the diminutive V.G. Vlasov replied, Your feelings have been hurt in the last few months, but I've heard nothing but fascist from your guards for 18 years. Do you think we have no feelings? And so the major promised to cut out the abusive word, fascist, a fair trade. After all these pernicious and destructive reforms, we may consider the separate history of the special camps concluded in 1954, and need no longer distinguish them from corrective labor camps. Throughout the topsy-turvy archipelago, easier times set in from 1954 and lasted till 1956, an era of unprecedented indulgences. Historians attracted to the 10-year reign of Nikita Khrushchev, when certain physical laws to which we had grown accustomed suddenly seemed to stop operating, when objects miraculously began defying the forces in the electromagnetic field, defying the pull of gravity, will inevitably be astounded to see how many opportunities were briefly concentrated in those hands, and how playfully, how frivolously they were used before they were nonchalantly tossed aside. Endowed with greater power than anyone in our history except Stalin, a power which, though impaired, was still enormous, he used it like Krylov's Mishka in the forest clearing, rolling his log first this way, then that, then all to no purpose. He was given the chance to draw the lines of freedom 3 times, 5 times more firmly, and he failed to understand his duty, abandoned it as though it were a game. For space, for maize, for rockets in Cuba, for Berlin ultimatums, for persecution of the church, for the splitting of the Oblast party committees, for the battle with abstract art. He never carried anything to its conclusion, least of all the fight for freedom. Stir him up against the intelligentsia? Nothing could have been simpler. Use his hands, the hands that wrecked Stalin's camps, to reinforce the camps now? That was easily achieved. And just think when. In 1956, the year of the 20th Congress, the first orders limiting relaxation of the camp regime were promulgated. They were extended in 1957, the year when Khrushchev achieved undivided power. But the caste of practical workers was still not satisfied. Scenting victory, they went over to the offensive. We can't go on like this. The camp system is the main prop of the Soviet regime, and it is collapsing. Yielding to this pressure without examining anything closely, without pausing to reflect that crime had not increased in those last 5 years, or that if it had, the causes must be sought in the political system, without considering how these new measures could be squared with his faith in the triumphal advance of communism, or attempting to study the matter in detail, or even to look at it with his own eyes. This Tsar, who had spent all his life on the road, light-heartedly signed the order for nails to knock the scaffold together again quickly, in its old shape and as sturdy as ever. And all this happened in the very year, 1961, when Nikita made his last, expiring effort to tug the cart of freedom up into the clouds. It was in 1961, the year of the 22nd Congress, that a decree was promulgated on the death penalty in the camps for terrorist acts against reformed prisoners, in other words, stoolies, and against supervisory staff, something which had never happened. And the plenum of the Supreme Court confirmed, in June 1961, regulations for 4 disciplinary categories in camps, Khrushchev's camps now, not Stalin's. When he climbed onto the Congress platform for another attack on Stalin's tyranny, Nikita had only just allowed the screws of his very own system to be turned no less tight, and he sincerely believed that all this could be fitted together and made consistent. The camps today are as approved by the party before the 22nd Congress. 6 years later, they are just as they were then. They differ from Stalin's camps not in regime, but in the composition of their population. There are no longer millions and millions of 58s, but there are still millions inside, and just as before, many of them are helpless victims of perverted justice, swept in simply to keep the system operating and well fed. Rulers change, the archipelago remains. It remains because that particular political regime could not survive without it. If it disbanded the archipelago, it would cease to exist itself. Every story must have an end. It must be broken off somewhere. To the best of our modest and inadequate ability, we have followed the history of the archipelago from the crimson volleys which greeted its birth to the pink mists of rehabilitation. In the glorious period of leniency and disarray on the eve of Khrushchev's measures to make the camps harsher again, on the eve of a new criminal code, let us consider our story ended. Other historians will appear, historians who, to their sorrow, know the Khrushchev and post-Khrushchev camps better than we do. 2 have in fact appeared already, S. Karavansky and Anatoly Marchenko, and they will float to the surface in great numbers. End of Part 7, Chapter 2. Part 7, Chapter 3. The Law Today. The reader has seen throughout this book, from the very beginning of the Stalin age, there have been no politicals in our country. The crowds, the millions driven past while you watched, all those millions of 58s, were merely common criminals. Besides, merry, mouthy Nikita Sergeyevich took so many bows from so many platforms. Politicals? Not a one. We just don't have them. And as grief grew forgetful, as distance softened craggy contours, as fat formed under the skin, we almost believed it. Even former Zeks did. Millions of Zeks were released for all to see, so perhaps there really were no politicals left. We had returned, others joined us, our friends and families were back. The gaps in our little world of urban intellectuals seemed to be filled, the ring closed. You could sleep undisturbed, and no one would have been taken from the house when you awoke. Friends would telephone, no one was missing. Not that we altogether believed it, but for practical purposes we accepted that there were no longer any politicals in jail. And Nikita was there, glued to his platform. There can be no return to deeds and occurrences such as these, either in the party or in the country generally. May 22nd, 1959. That was before Novocherkassk. Now everyone in our country can breathe freely, with no need to worry about the present or the future. March 8th, 1963. After Novocherkassk. Novocherkassk, a town of fateful significance in Russia's history. As though the Civil War had not left scars enough, it thrust itself beneath the saber yet again. Novocherkassk, a whole town of rebels, and every trace is licked clean and hidden. Even under Khrushchev, the fog of universal ignorance remained so thick that no one abroad got to know about Novocherkassk. There were no Western broadcasts to inform us of it, and even local rumor was stamped out before it could spread, so that the majority of our fellow citizens do not know what event is associated with the name Novocherkassk, and the date is June 2nd, 1962. Let me then put down here all that I have been able to gather. We can say without exaggeration that this was a turning point in the modern history of Russia. If we leave out the Ivanovo weavers at the beginning of the 30s, theirs was a large-scale strike, but it ended without violence. The flare-up at Novocherkassk was the first time the people had spoken out in 41 years, since Kronstadt and Tambov. Unorganized, leaderless, unpremeditated. It was a cry from the soul of a people who could no longer live as they had lived. On Friday, June 1st, one of those carefully considered enactments of which Khrushchev was so fond of publishing throughout the Union, raising the prices of meat and butter, on that very same day, as demanded by another and quite separate economic plan, piece rates at the huge electric locomotive works in Novocherkassk, NEVZ, were lowered, in some cases by 30%. That morning the workers in two shops, the forge and the foundry, usually obedient creatures of habit, geared to their jobs, could not force themselves to work. So hot had things become for them. Their loud, excited discussions developed into a spontaneous mass meeting, an everyday event in the West, an extraordinary one for us. By noon, the strike had spread throughout the enormous locomotive works. Runners were sent to other factories, where the workers wavered but did not come out in support. The Moscow-Rostov railway line runs close to the works, either to make sure that the news would reach Moscow more quickly, or to prevent troops and tanks from moving in. A large number of women sat down on the tracks to hold up trains, whereupon the men began pulling up the rails and building barriers. Strike action of such boldness is unusual in the history of the Russian workers' movement. Slogans appeared on the works building. Down with Khrushchev! Use Khrushchev for sausage meat! While all this was happening, troops and police began converging on the works. Tanks took up position on the bridge over Tuzlov. From evening until the following morning, movement inside the city or across the bridge was completely forbidden. Even during the night, the workers' settlement did not quiet down for a moment. Overnight, about 30 workers were arrested as ringleaders and carried off to the city police station. On the morning of June 2nd, some other enterprises in the town struck, but by no means all of them. Another spontaneous mass meeting at the NEVZ decided on a protest march into the town to demand the release of the arrested workers. The procession, only about 300 strong to begin with, you had to be brave, with women and children in its ranks, carrying portraits of Lenin and peaceful slogans, marched over the bridge past the tanks without obstruction, then uphill into town. Here their numbers were quickly swelled by curious onlookers, individual workers from other enterprises, and little boys. At several places in the city, people stopped lorries and used them as platforms for speech-making. The whole town was seething. The NEVZ demonstrators marched along the main street, Mostovskaya, and some of them began trying to break down the locked doors of the town police station in the belief that their arrested comrades were inside. They were met with pistol shots. All the streets were choked with people, and here, on the square, the crowd was densest. The party offices were found to be empty. The city authorities had fled to Rostov. It was about 11 a.m. There were no police to be seen in the town, but there were more and more troops. A revealing picture. At the first slight shock, the civil authorities hid behind the army. Soldiers had occupied the post office, the radio station, the bank. By this time, the whole of Novocherkassk was beleaguered, and every entry point and exit barred. Tanks crawled slowly along the Moskovskaya street, following the route demonstrators had taken toward party headquarters. Boys started scrambling onto the tanks and obstructing the observation slits. The tanks fired a few blank shells, rattling the windows of shops and houses along the street. The boys scattered and the tanks crawled on. And the students? Novocherkassk is, of course, a town of students. Where were they all? The students of some institutes, including the Polytechnic and of some technical secondary schools, had been locked in their dormitories or in other school buildings from early morning. Their rectors had thought quickly, but we may as well say it. The students, for their part, showed little civic courage. They were presumably glad of this excuse to do nothing. It would take more than the turn of a key to hold back rebel students in the West today, and took more in Russia in days gone by. A scuffle broke out inside the party building. Step by step, the speakers were dragged back inside, and soldiers emerged onto the balcony, more and more of them. A file of riflemen began forcing the crowd back from the small square immediately before the palace toward the railings of the garden. Several witnesses say unanimously that these soldiers were all non-Russians, Caucasians brought in from the other end of the oblast to replace the cordon from the local garrison previously posted there. But not all witnesses agree that the previous cordon had been ordered to open fire, and that the order was not carried out because the captain who received it killed himself in front of his men rather than pass it on. That an officer committed suicide is beyond doubt, but accounts of the circumstances are vague, and no one knows the name of this hero of conscience. It is not known who gave the order, but these soldiers raised their rifles and fired a first volley over the heads of the crowd. The burst fired over the heads of the crowd and found the trees in the little garden and the boys who had climbed into them, some of whom fell to the ground. The crowd, it seems, gave a roar, whereupon the soldiers, whether at command, or because they saw red, or in panic, started firing freely into the crowd, and yes, with dum-dum bullets. Remember Kenjir, the 16 at the guardhouse? The crowd fled in panic, jamming the narrow paths around the garden, but the troops went on firing at their backs as they retreated. Information from a variety of sources is more or less unanimous that some 70 or 80 people were killed. The soldiers looked around for lorries and buses, commandeered them, loaded them with the dead and the wounded, and dispatched them to the high-walled military hospital. For a day or two afterward, these buses went around with blood-stained seats. That day, just as in Kenjir, movie cameras took pictures of the rebels on the streets. The firing ceased, the terror passed, the crowd poured back onto the square, and was fired upon again. All this happened between noon and 1 p.m. This is what an observant witness saw at 2 p.m. There are about 8 tanks of different types standing on the square in front of party headquarters. A cordon of soldiers stands before them. The square is almost deserted. There are only small groups of people, mostly youngsters, standing about and shouting at the soldiers. On the square, puddles of blood have formed in depressions in the pavement. I am not exaggerating. I never suspected till now that there could be so much blood. The benches in the public garden are splattered with blood, and there are bloodstains on its sanded paths and on the whitewashed tree trunks in the public garden. The whole square is scored with tank tracks. A red flag, which the demonstrators had been carrying, is propped against the wall of party headquarters, and a gray cap splashed with red-brown blood has been slung over the top of its pole. Across the facade of the party building hangs a red banner there for some time past. The people and the party are one. People go up to the soldiers, to curse them or to appeal to their conscience. How could you do it? Who did you think you were shooting at? Your own people you were shooting at. They make excuses. We've only just been brought in and posted here. We had nothing to do with it. That's how efficient our murderers are, and yet people talk about bureaucratic sluggishness. He knows his business, that General Pliev. Toward 5 or 6 o'clock, the square gradually filled with people again. They were brave, the people of Novocherkassk. The town radio kept appealing to them. Citizens, do not fall for provocation. Go home quietly. The riflemen still stood there. The blood had not been mopped up, and again they pressed forward. Shouts from the crowd, more and more people, and another impromptu meeting. They knew by now that 6 senior members of the Central Committee had flown in, probably arriving before the first shootings. Among them, needless to say, Mikoyan, the expert on Budapest-type situations, Suslov and Frau Kozlov. A delegation of younger workers from NEVZ was sent to tell them what had happened. A buzz went through the crowd. Let Mikoyan come down here. Let him see all this blood for himself. Mikoyan wouldn't come down, thank you, but a reconnaissance helicopter flew low over the square around 6 o'clock, inspected it, flew off again. Shortly afterward, the workers' delegation came back. The delegates reported to the crowd that they had seen the Central Committee members and told them about this bloody Saturday, and that Kozlov had wept when he heard about the children falling from the trees at the first volley. You know Frau Kozlov, the Leningrad party gang boss, the cruelest of Stalinists? He wept. The Central Committee members had promised to investigate these events and severely punish those responsible. But for the present, everyone must go home to prevent the outbreak of fresh disorders in the town. The meeting, however, did not disperse. The crowd grew ever denser toward the evening, the desperate courage of Novocherkassk. Around 9 in the evening, they tried to drive the people away from the palace with tanks. But as soon as the drivers switched on their engines, people clustered around the tanks, blocking the hatches and the observation slits. The tanks stalled. The riflemen stood by and made no effort to help the tank crews. An hour later, tanks and armored personnel carriers appeared from the opposite side of the square, with an escort of Tommy gunners perched on top of them. At last, toward midnight, the riflemen began firing tracer bullets into the air, and the crowd slowly dispersed. What power there is in a popular disturbance, how quickly it changes the whole political situation. The night before there had been a curfew, and the people had been frightened away, but now the whole town was strolling about and hooting at the soldiers. A people transformed. Can it be so near to breaking through the crust of this half-century into a completely different atmosphere? On June 3rd, the town radio broadcast speeches by Mikoyan and Kozlov. Kozlov did not weep, nor did any of them promise to find the culprits. What they now said was that these events were the result of enemy provocation, and that these enemies would be severely punished. Mikoyan said further that dum-dum bullets had never been adopted as part of the equipment of Soviet troops, and that they must therefore have been used by enemies of the state. But who were these enemies? How had they parachuted into the country? Where were they hiding? Show us just one. We are so used to being treated like fools. Enemies, they say, and all is explained. In the Middle Ages, it was devils. The shops were immediately the richer for the butter, sausage, and many other things not seen in those parts for a long time, or anywhere outside the capitals. The wounded all vanished without a trace. Not one of them went home. Instead, the families of the wounded and the killed, who of course wanted to know what had become of their kin, were deported to Siberia. So were many of those involved in the demonstration who had been noticed or photographed. Some participants were dealt with in a series of trials in camera. There were also 2 public trials, with entry by ticket for factory party officials and for the town apparatchiki. At one of these, 9 men were sentenced to be shot and 2 women to 15 years imprisonment. On the Saturday following Bloody Saturday, the town radio announced that the workers of the electric locomotive works have solemnly undertaken to fulfill their 7-year plan ahead of time. At Alexandrovo in 1961, a year before Novocherkassk, the police beat a man to death while he was under arrest and would not allow his body to be carried past their precinct to the cemetery. The crowd was furious and burned down the police station. Arrests followed immediately. There was a similar incident about the same time in Murom. What would the appropriate charge now be? Under Stalin, even a tailor who stuck a needle in a newspaper could get Article 58. Now a more sensible view was taken. Wrecking a police station should not be regarded as a political act. It was ordinary banditry. Instructions were handed down to this effect. Mass disorders should not be treated as political offenses. If they are not political, what is? So all at once, there were no more politicals. But one stream has never dried up in the USSR and still flows. A stream of criminals untouched by the beneficent wave summoned to life. A stream which flowed uninterruptedly through all those decades, whether Leninist norms were infringed or strictly observed, and flowed into Khrushchev's day more fiercely than ever. I mean the believers, those who resisted the new wave of cruel persecution, the wholesale closing of churches, monks who were slung out of their monasteries, stubborn sectarians, especially those who refused to perform military service. There's nothing we can do about it. We're really very sorry. But you're directly aiding imperialism. We let you off lightly nowadays. It's 5 years first time round. These are in no sense politicals, they are religionists, but they have to be re-educated. Believers must be dismissed from their jobs merely for their faith. Komsomols must be sent along to break the windows of believers. Believers must be officially compelled to attend anti-religious lectures. Church doors must be cut down with blowtorches, domes pulled down with hawsers attached to tractors, gatherings of old women broken up with fire hoses. Is this what you mean by dialogue, French comrades? As the monks of the Pukayev monastery were told in the Soviet of Workers' Deputies, if we always observe Soviet laws, we shall have to wait a long time for communism. Only in extreme cases, when educational methods do not help, is the recourse to law necessary. Here we can dazzle the world with the diamond-pure nobility of our laws today. We no longer try people in closed courts, as under Stalin. We no longer try them in absentia. We try them semi-publicly, that is to say, in the presence of a semi-public. I hold in my hand a record of the trial of some Baptists at Nikitovka in the Donbas in January 1964. This is how it's done. On the pretense that their identity must be checked, the Baptists who arrived to attend the trial were held in jail for 3 days, until the trial was over, and to give them a fright, someone, a free citizen, who threw flowers to the defendants, got 10 days. So did a Baptist who kept a record of the trial, and his notes were taken away. But another record survived. A bunch of hand-picked Komsomols were let in before the general public by a side door, so that they could occupy the front rows. While the trial was in progress, there were shouts from the spectators. Pour kerosene over the lot and set fire to them. The court did nothing to curb this righteous indignation. Typical of its procedures, it admitted the evidence of hostile neighbors and also that of terrorized minors. The little girls of 9 and 11 were brought before the court. Who the hell cares what effect it has on them as long as we get our verdict? Their exercise books with texts from the scriptures were introduced as exhibits. One of the defendants, Bazbai, father of 9 children, was a minor who had never received any support from the Union Committee at his pit because he was a Baptist. But they managed to confuse his daughter Nina, a schoolgirl in the 8th grade, and to suborn her with 50 rubles from the Union Committee and a promise to place her in an institute later on, so that during the investigation she made fantastic statements against her father. He had tried to poison her with a sour fruit drink. When the believers were hiding in the woods for their prayer meetings, because they were persecuted in the settlement, they had a radio transmitter, a tall tree with wire wound all around it. Afterward, these lying statements began to prey on Nina's mind. She became mentally ill and was put in the violent ward of an asylum. Nonetheless, she was produced in court in the expectation that she would stick to her evidence. But she repudiated every word of it. The interrogator dictated what I had to say himself. It made no difference. The shameless judge ignored her latest statements and regarded only her earlier evidence as valid. Whenever depositions favorable to the prosecution come unstuck, this is the typical and regular dodge used by the courts. They ignore what is brought out in court and base themselves on faked evidence obtained in the preliminary investigation. Now, what do you mean by that? It says here in your deposition, you testified during the investigation. What right have you to retract now? That's an offense too, you know. The judge is not at all interested in the substance of the case, in the truth. The Baptists are persecuted because they do not accept preachers sent by an atheist plenipotentiary of the state, but prefer their own. Under Baptist rules, any brother can preach the gospel. There is a directive from the Oblast Party Committee. Put them on trial and forcibly take their children from them. And this will be carried out, although with the left hand the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet has just, July 2, 1962, signed the World Convention on the Fight Against Discrimination in the Sphere of Education. One of its points is that parents must be allowed to provide for the religious and moral education of their children in accordance with their own convictions. But that is precisely what we cannot allow. Anyone who speaks in court on the substance of the case, anyone who tries to clarify the issue, is invariably interrupted, diverted from his train of thought, deliberately confused by the judge, who conducts the debate on this level. How can you talk about the end of the world when we are committed to the building of communism? This is from the closing statement made by one young girl, Xenia Klopanina. Instead of going to the cinema or to dances, I used to read the Bible and say my prayers, and just for that you are taking my freedom from me. Yes, to be free is a great happiness, but to be free from sin is a greater still. Lenin said that only in Turkey and Russia did such shameful phenomena as religious persecution still exist. I've never been in Turkey and know nothing about it, but how things are in Russia you can see for yourselves. She was cut short. The sentences. 2 of them got 5 years in the camps, 2 of them 4 years, and Basby, the father of all those children, got 3. The defendants accepted their sentences joyfully and said a prayer. The representatives from enterprises shouted, "Not long enough, make it more," throw kerosene over them and put a match to it. The long-suffering Baptists took note and kept count, and set up a council of prisoners' relatives, which began issuing manuscript bulletins about all the persecutions. From these bulletins we learn that from 1961 to June 1964, 197 Baptists were condemned, 15 of them women. They are all listed by name. Prisoners' dependents, now left without means of support, have also been counted, 442, of whom 341 are under school age. The majority get 5 years of exile, but some get 5 years in a strict regime camp, narrowly escaping the hardened criminals' motley, with 3 to 5 years in exile in addition. B.M. Zorovets from Olshiny in Kharkov Oblast got 7 years of strict regime for his faith. A 76-year-old, Y.V. Erend, was put inside, as were the whole Lozovoy family, father, mother, and son. Yevgeny M. Sorokin, a Group 1, disabled veteran of the Fatherland War, blind in both eyes, was condemned in the village of Sokolovo, Zimyevsk district. Kharkov Oblast to 3 years in a camp for bringing up his children Lubya, Nadia, and Raya as Christians, and they were taken away from him by order of the court. The court trying the Baptist M.I. Brodovsky at Nikolaev, October 6, 1966, was not too squeamish to use crudely faked documents. When the defendant protested, "This is dishonest of you," they barked back at him, "The law will crush you, smash you, destroy you." The law, my friend, not one of your acts of extrajudicial vengeance, as practiced in the years when norms were still observed. We recently got to know S. Karavansky's soul-chilling petition, which was transmitted from a camp to the outside world. The author had been sentenced to 25 years, had served 16 of them, 1944 to 1960, had been released, evidently under the 2/3 rule, had been married, had begun a university course, but no, in 1965 they came for him again. Get yourself ready, you still have 9 years to go. Where else is this possible, under what other code of law on earth except ours? There are quite a few people like this. People who were not affected by the epidemic of releases under Khrushchev, the teammates, cellmates, transit prison acquaintances whom we left behind. We have long ago forgotten them in our new lives, but they still shuffle hopelessly, drearily, numbly about the same little patches of trampled earth, with the same watchtowers and barbed wire fences all around them. The faces on the papers change. The speeches from the platforms change. People fight against the cult and then stop fighting. But then the 25-year prisoners, Stalin's godchildren, are still inside. Karavansky cites the blood-freezing prison careers of several such people. All you freedom-loving left-wing thinkers in the West, you left-laborites, you progressive American, German, and French students, as far as you are concerned, none of this amounts to much. As far as you are concerned, this whole book of mine is a waste of effort. You may suddenly understand it all some day, but only when you yourselves hear, "Hands beneath your backs there," and step ashore on our archipelago. Still, there is really no comparison between the numbers of political prisoners now and in Stalin's time, and they are no longer counted in the millions or the hundreds of thousands. Is this because the law has been reformed? It is just that the ship has changed course for a time. We call this chapter The Law Today. It should rightly be called There Is No Law. The same treacherous secrecy, the same fog of injustice, still hangs in our air, worse than the smoke of the city chimneys. For half a century and more the enormous state has towered over us, girded with hoops of steel. The hoops are still there. There is no law. End of Part 7, Chapter 3. End of the Gulag Archipelago Abridged.